The Bible does not answer every question we have. In fact, there are verses that raise more questions than they answer. Genesis 6:4, for instance, mentions Nephilim and the sons of God sleeping with the daughters of men. And Enoch was written basically just to explain what that means. Genesis 41:45 says that the godly man Joseph married the daughter of a pagan Egyptian priest. How did that work? Well, the scroll of Joseph and Asenath explores that problem. How could Solomon use slaves to build the temple? Well, they were slave demons, of course, like we dealt with in the previous video. Throughout history, people have gotten stuck on troublesome passages in Scripture and have tried to come up with explanations that ease the confusion and irritation that those passages cause. Perhaps that's why Revelation is such a popular book to write about today. But like with many modern interpretations of Revelation, the search for inventive answers to our questions about the Bible often cause new issues to appear, which were even more problematic than the ones that they attempted to solve. Certainly this was the case with many of the explanations that the Jewish rabbis came up with after Judah returned from exile. Their method of learning often encouraged allegory and imaginative readings of Scripture in an attempt to make everything fit together. Even seemingly normal issues got the full imaginative treatment, like how the Israelites found water when they were wandering around in the desert. Out of 40 years of wandering in the desert, there is a large section where the Bible does not mention that the people had any water. In fact, in the center of their wanderings, finding water is mentioned only twice. At Horeb, in the beginning of their journey, where Moses struck a rock and it became a spring, and at Meribah, right at the end of their journey, where Moses struck a rock and it became a spring. Other than that, they wandered years without any mention of water. And to some people, this was a problem that demanded explanation beyond a simple, well, the Bible doesn't mention it, but they had to have found it somewhere. Some people latched onto a verse in Exodus that promised that God's blessings would be on the people's food and water. This concept kept getting expanded until the Jewish philosopher Philo, writing around the time of Jesus, says that the people drank from God's wisdom, literally and metaphorically, that God's wisdom was poured on them and sustained them. However, alongside of that, there is another explanation growing as well. One version, found in the Targum Onkelos, the Aramaic translation of the Hebrew law that became the official translation for Eastern Babylonian Jews, took a later well from Numbers 21 and said that it had moved with the people, disappearing and reappearing as it was needed. That this wasn't a new building of a well, it was a refinding. In the Book of Biblical Antiquities, this idea becomes even more explicit, with it saying the water of Marah was made sweet and followed them in the desert 40 years. The source of water followed them. Other people accepted this moving well idea, but said that the two rocks that Moses struck were the same one, and that rock followed them through the desert, like a pet. Moses' pet rock, watering the desert behind them for 40 years. These ideas, even though they aren't found in the Old Testament, saturated the Jewish culture for centuries. Of course, that's a crazy idea, though. A pet rock following Moses and the Israelites around? We certainly wouldn't find that in the New Testament, except that Paul says exactly that. 1 Corinthians 10:3. For they, meaning the Israelites wandering in the desert, all ate the same spiritual food and drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that accompanied them, and that rock was Christ. The rock that accompanied them. Moses' pet rock gets quoted in the New Testament. So what is going on here? Well, once again, we see that there is humanity in the Bible as well as divinity, and that the authors did not write from a bubble, but wrote out of their own culture, their own experience, their own assumptions. Paul is taking the tradition of the Israelites drinking wisdom and that the split rock followed them, and he's combining them to make a point about Jesus, that Jesus is the wisdom of God made flesh. He is sustaining and providing and present and yet unappreciated and ignored, even though it is Jesus that is sustaining these people as they wander through life. That he is the water in the desert that never abandons us wherever we go. And knowing the context of what Paul is saying, for me, makes what Paul says far more powerful. I don't need it to have literally happened to recognize that Paul believed it and to appreciate the beauty and the truth behind the imagery. Because it's a beautiful image, but it's one that's definitely coming from places outside of the Old Testament. Next week is going to be taking a look at how much sex is definitely in the Bible and why we tend to ignore it. As always, thank you for watching. Have a great week. See you next Friday.